So yeah, we're gonna. The presentation is on household archaeology at Letchworth Mounds with me, Marty Menz. So, there we go. All right, slide switched. Okay, so to place this in kind of like a broader context, the topic that I'm really interested in for my dissertation research is southeastern ceremonial centers, specifically those dating to the Woodland period. So in the Gulf Coast, the Gulf Coastal Plain, so we're talking about like the Gulf Coast of Florida and adjacent parts of Georgia and Alabama, you have a lot of these large multi-mound ceremonial centers that pop up during the Woodland period. So these dates, 200 BC to AD 900, are kind of like roughly the dates that I'm really interested in. And here are some examples of some of these sites that I'm interested in studying. So these ceremonial centers are characterized by having multiple mounds, often including at least one platform mound, it's like almost 60 feet tall platform mound at Kolomoki, or the nearly 50 foot tall one at Letchworth. They're usually the largest one at the site, the platform mound is. And these sites usually also include at least one, but often several smaller kind of like low dome or conical shaped sand burial mounds. These sites usually also have interior plazas that are kind of bracketed by mounds and habitation debris. And these plazas are presumably used for communal ceremonies. And these sites usually also have extensive middens or artifact scatters, which have been used by archaeologists to interpret these sites as villages. So basically places where people were living on a permanent basis year round. And this is important for talking about ceremonial centers in the Gulf Coastal Plain as being villages, because that is not the case for ceremonial centers dating to this time period elsewhere in Eastern North America. So I'm going to try and place that in context in a little bit. So the Woodland period ceremonial centers of the research area that I'm focusing on, the Gulf Coastal Plain, fall into three phases that are defined on the basis of radiocarbon dates, but in the absence of radiocarbon dates, on diagnostic artifacts like pottery and projectile points. So the first of these phases, the Deptford phase, and you have the dates here, where you have some of these ceremonial centers start to crop up across the landscape, and it's kind of characterized by check and simple stamped pottery. Then we move on to the Swift Creek phase. Again, dates for that there. This kind of phase is characterized by this complicated or curvilinear stamped pottery. So it's basically this complicated, almost like some of them look kind of like a fingerprint design impressed onto clay before the pot is fired. These ceremonial center sites seem to kind of proliferate during this phase. And then after that, you go into the Weeden Island 1 phase, and the dates for this one are, that late date of 8900 is maybe a little late for this, but you have some of these sites continuing on, but pottery seems to change quite a bit. You no longer have stamped pottery, or Swift Creek pottery is still part of assemblages in domestic context, but then you start to see more of this kind of like incised and punctated ceramic types that show up as well. And one of the interesting things that kind of happens along the progression of these phases is during the Deptford, especially the Deptford and even into the Swift Creek phase, you have what seems to be interactions or connections with the interior. So evidence for what people talk about as like Hopewell exchange items showing up at sites like Crystal River that date to quite early. So like probably in this Deptford phase. And that seems to wane a little bit in kind of later phases. So like the Swift Creek phase, by the time you get to Weeden Island 1, there is still, an exchange network occurring, but it's mostly focused on the Gulf Coast. It's more kind of like regionally specific to that Gulf Coast region. And so the thing that I'm really focused on is habitation and domestic life at ceremonial centers, and figuring out kind of like what the nature of occupation at these sites is. Are they really villages, all of them, as we like to interpret them, or is there some difference there? And so like we have this mural. I think it's a lovely mural out at Letchworth. If you've ever visited the site, you've probably seen it in their pavilion. But the mural really focuses on mound construction. That's basically the focus of a lot of the previous research that's occurred at Letchworth, with some notable exceptions. And so we know a lot, or prior to my fieldwork, we knew quite a lot about, how and when these mounds at the site were constructed, but not as much about habitation. We knew kind of like the spatial distribution of habitation, but not as much kind of like focused. We didn't have as much focused data on actual habitation contexts. So I want to move then into, in terms of talking about like whether or not ceremonial centers were villages or not. I want to talk about this kind of like contrast that archaeologists have kind of built up between mobile hunter-gatherers and settled villagers. So all of these ceremonial centers in the Gulf Coast that I'm talking about, dating to the Woodland period, were built by hunter-gatherers. So these are people that, this is a time period before maize agriculture enters the Southeast. And there is evidence elsewhere in the Eastern woodlands for what's called like the Eastern Agricultural Complex. So these are pre-maize cultigens that were grown by people as food. But evidence for their intensive use in the Southeast, especially in the Gulf Coastal Plain, is pretty scant. So these are people that are basically not relying on grown or domesticated foods and are instead existing on a hunting and gathering subsistence base. And so when people kind of make this kind of like distinction or dichotomy between mobile hunter-gatherers, so these are people that move across the landscape, they sometimes aggregate into larger settlements, but most of the time they're moving around, and settled villagers, they kind of, there are a couple of key distinctions that they make. One of those is in terms of their sociality. So basically like their social relations and how people interact with one another. So as I've been doing my dissertation research, I've really been focusing on how the dichotomies that archaeologists and anthropologists have built up really don't hold up to too much scrutiny. That there's a lot of kind of like ambiguity in some of these distinctions that I don't think holds up when you really question it. So to start out, the sociality of mobile hunter-gatherers is really seasonally flexible. A lot of mobile hunter-gatherers aggregate into large sites, and this is known ethnographically, and we think we have evidence for it archaeologically. And so their social organization, political organization also changes when their settlement shifts, when they aggregate seasonally. There's also this kind of pattern that's really well known for hunter-gatherers that they usually practice this generalized and immediate sharing. But that's usually limited to the co-resident group. And so when people aggregate together, they usually don't practice immediate generalized sharing with everybody in these broader aggregated camps. Hunter-gatherer band membership is really fluid. So that means people come in and out of co-resident or kind of like band groups pretty frequently. And interaction occurs on a regional scale. So you have a lot of social interactions in hunter-gatherer societies that are among more socially distant people. And I think an important part of that is that formal obligations or relationships or kind of like formal institutions that govern subsistence, marriage, ceremony, alliances, all of those types of things that some people think of as being characteristic of villagers are also practiced by mobile hunter-gatherers, especially when they're aggregating. So that distinction between those two groups of people breaks down. Then we go on to space. Mobile hunter-gatherers do aggregate into large encampments on a seasonal basis pretty regularly. It's a pretty common thing that we know of ethnographically. Like I said, we think we have pretty good evidence for this archaeologically going back pretty far into time. These are sometimes like plaza-oriented encampments or aggregation sites. So for instance, like this Bull Brook site right here in Massachusetts, this is a Paleo-Indian site. So this is like over 10,000 years old, and they're doing this, and it's almost 100 meters across. This is the same scale as we would see at like a woodland period ring midden village in Wakulla County. At these sites, spatial distance equates to social distance. So basically people live closer to people that they're more closely related to and farther away from people that they're more distantly related to. And that's common between those two types of settlement. Domestic space is structured in similar ways. And in environments where it's necessary, mobile hunter-gatherers do practice domestic storage, like, storage in domestic context. So like pits, basically to keep food when they have a lot of food that comes to them all at once, and they have the ability or the need to put it away and hold on to it for later. So that kind of conflicts with this idea of generalized and immediate sharing again. There's also investments in infrastructure, so like hunting architecture. And there's also like similar architecture in some regions between villagers and hunter-gatherers. So then there's also this kind of like distinction between mobile hunter-gatherers and villagers in terms of ceremony really breaks down. Archaeologists that are familiar with the eastern woodlands of North America know that hunter-gatherers were building mounds, doing all sorts of really complex, ceremonial stuff, long-distance exchange networks, social interaction, all of that for a very long time, going back, pretty early into the Archaic period, if not into the Paleo-Indian period. It has a very long history in the eastern woodlands, and they are hunter-gatherers, and a lot of those populations are mobile. So that distinction kind of breaks down as well. And then finally, with mobility, this one is, you'd kind of think that mobility is a distinction that is kind of like a necessary component of even just saying mobile versus settled. But one of the things that I want to highlight here is that settled villagers do move. So there are these ideas about like scalar stress or an irritation coefficient that are basically intrinsic to populations once they start to gather in a single place and grow. And this occurs not just when people settle permanently, but also when hunter-gatherers aggregate. They're living in contexts of like more dense populations than they're used to. And so it creates social conflict. However, aggregating hunter-gatherers, mobile people, when they come together seasonally, they have a built-in pressure valve because they break up and disperse after their aggregation phase is over. But for villagers, they're usually constrained to kind of live in the same place, either from environmental or social factors in the broader landscape, so that's circumscription, or because they are invested in kind of like social ties or kind of like labor projects within their specific village that make them unlikely to leave. But that doesn't mean that people don't ever leave. Fissioning or voting with your feet. So like in a lot of village societies, so the Yanomami are a great example known from ethnography. When conflict within a village gets too intense, part of the village just breaks off and goes and forms their own village somewhere else, basically creating that distance. They kind of disperse in the way that mobile hunter-gatherers do, but on a more permanent basis. And voting with your feet is something that archaeologists talk about for even kind of like, the well-known kind of like chiefly societies of the Mississippian period. This kind of voting with your feet, basically to get away from leaders that common people feel like aren't acting in their best interest anymore, is kind of like a central feature of what people talk of in terms of like chiefdom cycling, basically, that like these boom and bust cycles among chiefdoms. And it's not just for political reasons too, like villagers can move because of resource depletion, so they can just, basically burn down their settlement and go and create another village somewhere else. So villagers move. Just because we talk about sedentary people doesn't mean we're talking about people who are totally immobile. They just move on kind of like a different time scale. And kind of on a even broader, kind of like more high-minded theoretical note, there is kind of like some interpretive baggage between dichotomizing mobility and sedentism in the ways that we do. So like the developmental package of complexity. So we're talking about like, domestication of plant resources, sedentism, monumentality, all of those things archaeologists have basically pulled those apart and shown them to be different processes at this point. They are related to some degrees, like you can't say that they're not, but they are independent. You have some groups that have one and not that have some of these and not the others. So they don't come as a package. There's also what at least one anthropologist has termed this kind of like sedentarist ideology that has structured the focus of social evolutionary research in anthropology and archaeology since the creation of the disciplines. And basically what this kind of gets at is that just like, settled villagers are more like us, and we view people that are more like us as being more developed. And that's basically what that means. And so like to go back to this distinction in terms of forms of sociality, that this one guy, Ingold, talks about. I think that this is kind of like recreating what some anthropologists, so this guy, Charlie Cobb, he's at University of Florida, has written about this. He didn't coin the term savage slot, but he talks about it. And I think basically like dichotomizing mobile and sedentary people can in some ways kind of like recreate this savage slot with a mobile other, in contrast, again, to sedentary people that are more like us. That basically, like, because hunter-gatherers are seen as having like a distinct form of sociality, it means that they are like in a very important way kind of like removed from the way that like you or I interact with one another. And that, you know, that there might be some connection between settled people and our forms of sociality as mediated through social institutions and stuff that hunter-gatherers, mobile hunter-gatherers don't have. I don't believe that. I don't buy it. So one of the reasons why I think my research questions and this project is important, not just for talking about Gulf Coast archaeology and Florida archaeology, but also for kind of like, you know, the broader archaeology of Eastern North America, is that there are ceremonial centers that are built by either hunting and gathering people, or, you know, people that we don't think of as being like, you know, settled village farmer types all over the Eastern woodlands. There are some really famous examples. If you've heard of the Hopewell earthworks in Ohio, or the Pinson Mounds in Western Tennessee, all of those sites are very extensive, earth moving on a scale that puts places like Kolomoki and Letchworth to shame. And there is basically no evidence that people were living at these sites. Instead, evidence for habitation is very like small scale and dispersed. And so I think questioning how we interpret the habitation at ceremonial centers in the Gulf Coast is important, because it can teach us kind of some lessons about how and why the process of kind of like settlement aggregation can occur here, maybe why it didn't at some places. So I am going to be my research is kind of focused on pulling apart three different kind of scenarios for ceremonial center occupation. One being that people were living in villages. So, you know, permanent settlements, not necessarily supported by agriculture. You can have hunter-gatherer villages, or seasonal aggregations. So seasonal periodic gatherings of mobile people, or persistent places, which are sites that are composed of multiple occupations over a long period of time that in the aggregate look like one large settlement, but in fact, that site was never occupied by a bunch of people all at once. It's just these small occupations that, just because we don't have the temporal resolution to pull them apart, we think of as all being one site. So to move on then to kind of like my case study, I've been working at Letchworth Mounds, which you probably already heard. So if you don't know where Letchworth is, it's kind of like on the road to Monticello. It's got a big 50-foot platform mound, and it's kind of on the south end of Lake Miccosukee. So it's a state park. If you haven't visited there, you should. It's very pleasant. So here is kind of a map of the site showing you the large platform mound, the distribution of some of the other mounds at the site, the plaza. So this is a big empty area. And then an artifact scatter, a big artifact scatter that's about like half a kilometer wide, that's south of the large mounds. And so again, my project is focused on the habitation areas, so specifically household archaeology. So my field work back in 2019 and 2020 consisted of first kind of like clearing some areas across the site and conducting 26,900 square meters of gradiometer survey. So this is a remote sensing technique that allows us to basically identify archaeological features under the ground before we dig. So it means that we basically don't have to try to find a needle in a haystack. It's very nice. And then so moving on from that, I excavated 9 1x2 meter ground truthing units. Basically, I wanted to, we can't tell exactly what an anomaly is just by looking at the picture. So we still do have to dig to make sure that what we're seeing as an anomaly is actually an archaeological feature. It turns out that several of them were like, not, we're not. We're historic features or even a piece of metal that was just really deep. But a couple of them were archaeological features. So one of those, a very good, what looked like a very good cluster of features, I placed a 4x4 block meter excavation over, and that's what I'm going to talk about to you now. So I started off with excavation unit 1. Go figure, the first unit that I put in, and then I walked around doing 8 more units when I could have just like expanded this excavation even more than I did. Probably found more cool stuff, but that's the way it goes sometimes. So in this unit, I found in this profile, you see the big anomaly that I was trying to find is this stratified hearth. So you have a stage right here. Hopefully you guys can see my cursor on the screen. That was over top of an earlier stage of the hearth that seems to be separated by a band of kind of like light sand. So it looks like one stage of the hearth was burned. They covered it over with light sand and burned another stage of the hearth on top of it. The upper stage had a bunch of rocks in it. And then 2 of these features in the opposite profile, I initially thought that these might be large posts, but based on the distribution of other features, when I expanded this into a block, I actually think that these are small pits. So again, here's just those profiles for you to take a look at. So here's excavation unit 1 that I placed, and here's how block 1 goes over it. So here's how I broke up the blocks. This is when I excavated block 1. This was where I was alone. So prior to this, I actually did have quite a bit of volunteers from past and from Florida State and others that came out and helped me, and that was very helpful. But when I started digging this was the month of lockdown that Florida did. I don't know if you remember this, April 2020, when the good old governor basically said, everybody stay home, and then decided that COVID was real. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that in the state building, or if I'll get like the feed will get cut. But anyway, yeah. So I excavated this by myself, and you can see here that I found some featured distributions that look like that it looks like the walls of a structure, at least. So like this arc of these stains right here. And so I think that that's an exterior wall for a structure. You can see it right here as well. And I'll show some additional kind of features or the kind of like layout of the unit here in a second. I also found quite a bit of diagnostic artifacts that gave me an idea of when this structure dated to. So a lot of the site has Swift Creek pottery, but it seems like there is kind of like some later Swift Creek and going into Wheaton Island 1 phase stuff elsewhere at the site. This part of the site seemed to be mostly early Swift Creek. So these kind of like scalloped rimmed sherds right here are indicative of an early phase Swift Creek, as well as these projectile points. So these pointed to an oxidation that I was thinking of as being like maybe like the 3rd or 4th centuries AD. And so here's kind of like the breakdown of other ceramic and artifact types that I got. So here are some of these like Swift Creek pottery types. There's a few different kind of like complicated stamp variants. So you have your Crooked River St. Andrews complicated stamp that are all there, as well as some Deptford pottery, which again made me think that this stuff dates pretty early. So again, like I said, like probably like 3rd or 4th century. When I actually submitted radiocarbon dates, though, it seemed like things were a bit later than I was expecting. So more into like the 5th and 6th century. So here's the distribution of all of the features in the unit. So some of these kind of pits that actually look better once I profiled them, as well as this large hearth. This thing right here is just a big disturbance, probably a historic tree throw that like blew up like a third of the structure, unfortunately. But yeah, so all of those dates cluster nicely together. These are all of the ones from the structure. So just before I continue on with like interpreting the structure, I want to talk about the radiocarbon dates and the features, because I think this is really important. A lot of the features that make up what I've interpreted as the structure are kind of like, diffuse. They're hard to see. They're these just kind of like almost like smudges. So I wanted to be careful about how I dated these, I wanted to be careful that I was interpreting it correctly. So I dated a bunch of them rather. So I dated 3 of the post holes. These small little kind of post holes, they're only like, they're like 10 centimeters in diameter. They're pretty small. But I dated 3 of them. All of the dates line up basically right on top of each other, which is exactly what you want to see for a structure that you're interpreting. Like if you're interpreting a structure, all the post holes should date to the same time. And they do, thankfully. Then I dated both stages of the hearth. They're all right on top of each other as well, as well as most of the pits. This one pit dates a little bit later, but its early tail does overlap with the other dates enough that I'm pretty confident in saying that all of these features that I've identified in this structure they are all together, that they're all part of the same structure. So I can say, based on the distribution of these features, that this structure was roughly circular, probably around 4.3 meters in diameter. Obviously, we don't have like the whole thing, but if I'm interpreting this arc as basically, if the structure is circular and I basically take the distance from the hearth to the wall and extrapolate it all the way around, it's around 4.3 meters in diameter. And again, these are small diameter post holes. So like around 10 centimeters wide, and they're about 25 to 30 centimeters apart. Some of them actually do look like they might have been reset. So maybe like some maintenance of the building, or that the structure was maybe like rebuilt in place. Like some of these ones where they seem like they overlap. But it's kind of unclear because all the dates are so close together. So in terms of interpreting the structure, it's probably a bent pole construction. So similar to what you'd think of as like a wigwam or something like that from kind of like the Great Lakes in the Northeast. So yeah, it's like this bent pole frame structure, probably roofed with like palmetto or some other kind of thatch. The artifacts and interior storage features, so those interior pits, I think point to a domestic use, but a ceremonial use, I can't rule that out. Like this structure definitely does have a lot of formal similarities with like a sweat lodge. But I think that at a site like a large ceremonial center where a lot of people are coming there for ceremony, that even domestic structures probably pull double duty, I would imagine, as things like sweat lodges or other like ceremonial structures when needed. So I think you could probably say both. I just didn't find any artifacts that were like a dead ringer for some kind of like ceremonial practice occurring. Pretty much all of the artifacts were things like domestic pottery, chipped stone debris, and projectile points and things. But this kind of like structure is very similar to what later Spanish accounts describe for the Appalachee in the same area. So like later Appalachee houses that are described by chroniclers from the Narvaez and DeSoto from their expeditions describe Appalachee houses as being covered with hay or palms and straw. So this structure is smaller than what we know of for Appalachee houses from like Mission San Luis, which are around like 5.7 meters in diameter and probably have like slightly larger posts, but it's similar enough that it seems like, there's kind of like continuity in structure, form, and kind of construction in the area through time. And so when I compare Letchworth then to domestic structures at other ceremonial centers, we see some kind of like interesting patterns emerge that can allow me to make some interpretations about kind of how Letchworth is probably different from other sites. So the first is Letchworth's structure it's not extremely larger or smaller than any of the others. It seems kind of like right on line with what we would expect for domestic structures based on these other sites. It's probably large enough to house a nuclear family. 4.3 meters is like, it doesn't sound like that much, but it's like, I've actually thought I've measured around in my house and it's larger than like my living room, which when you compare to a lot of pre-Columbian domestic structures is like not that bad. Especially because a lot of activities are occurring outside of the house. Larger structures at Block Stearns, which is also very near Tallahassee, might indicate larger household size and household inequality, which is, I think, something important to think about for kind of, again, differences between these sites. Block Stearns is like one of the only sites, one of the only ceremonial centers where we have evidence of more than one structure. So, you know, I think that's pretty significant. The structure at Letchworth is more lightly constructed than other structures. So it's built with this like kind of bent pole frame. So it probably means that there's less investment placed in domestic architecture than at these other sites. A lot of these other sites have, like, if you look at the post hole size comparison between Block Stearns structures and at Letchworth, the structures at Block Stearns are made using these kind of like single set rigid posts that probably maybe had like gabled roofs or something like that, where they're not bending the poles over into kind of like a dome shape. So I think that Letchworth's more lightly constructed structure hints at greater mobility. So people are moving around more, they're not investing as much in their houses. However, on the flip side, the interior hearth and storage pits. So the Letchworth structure has more interior features than any other contemporaneous domestic structure that I was able to like find evidence for from specifically woodland period ceremonial centers. So I want to be clear about kind of my sample here. So I think that indicates that there's more of a focus on kind of privacy and control over resources at the household level at Letchworth. Whereas, like for instance, Tom Placan, who worked at Kolomoki and excavated this Block A structure, interpreted the lack of interior features and even kind of just like storage features right near this house as potential evidence of kind of like that there was control or pooling of resources at a level beyond the household. So like a domestic cluster or like groups of households. And this is kind of a more kind of like communal way of living that he associated with basically the emergence of a village there. Letchworth, as we'll get into even more, doesn't seem to be a village. So this greater focus on like household autonomy, I think is correlated with that. Again, here's just a comparison of some of these structures. Again, you can look at the size in square meters. And the Letchworth structure is different, way different from the others in terms of, interior pit volume, and its construction in terms of being a flexed pole structure. None of the others are. I also want to point out here that this sample size is very small. I'm very aware of that. But one of the reasons why finding the structure at Letchworth was so important is because there are so few of these structures from woodland period ceremonial centers, or even just like woodland period sites in general, from the Gulf coastal plain. There are a couple of researchers writing like 20 years ago who basically describe how we don't know anything about houses from this time period. And so like 20 years later, the sample size has increased by like 1, and that's this one. So just for some context and why the sample size is so small. Then to further compare Letchworth in terms of artifact density, which I think is indicative of how many people were living there and how intensively. So basically, whether Letchworth is a village like some of these other sites or not, the ceramic density at Letchworth, artifact densities in general, are super low all over the site. So like Block 1 at Letchworth had the highest ceramic densities of anywhere at the site. You see it right here compared to sites like Kolomoki and some of these other ones. It's basically like doesn't even show up. Like in this site at Kolomoki, or this context at Kolomoki, is from right near the plaza. So you wouldn't even expect that to be very high. And it's not, but it's still way higher than what we see even at the densest area at Letchworth. A more apt comparison might be between contexts at Letchworth, which I think are probably more like an aggregation site, and the kind of like seasonal occupation area at Kolomoki, which is to the south. But even then, like the ceramic and artifact density at Letchworth just kind of pales in comparison. So with all of that data put together, I've kind of come up with an interpretation for what I think is going on at Letchworth in terms of its habitation and its role within a larger settlement system. So First, I think Letchworth seems to be different from the other centers. I think, and I agree with the archaeologists who have worked at a lot of those other civic ceremonial centers, that those are probably villages, ceremonial villages, or whatever kind of terminology they want, but that people were probably, at least a portion of the population at those sites was living there year round. At Letchworth, I don't think that was the case. Instead, I see Letchworth as kind of the hub of interaction for a dispersed and perhaps more mobile population that I think was probably centered on Lake Miccosukee, and that they could have just made it very easily, even if you lived 10 kilometers away on the north end of Lake Miccosukee, you had easy water access to Letchworth, at least in times when the sinkhole was plugged up and Lake Miccosukee actually held water. Because as y'all saw with Lake Jackson, like a year ago, it's not always filled with water. That's kind of a natural process for these prairie lakes. And so it would have been the same at Lake Miccosukee, especially with no kind of like spillway dam. So I think that Letchworth, like I said, is the anchor for a low density kind of like settlement pattern across Lake Miccosukee that I think mirrors what we know for other kinds of extensive low density settlement. So people talk about like low density urbanism when they talk about like Angkor Wat in Cambodia and stuff like that. I'm not trying to suggest Letchworth is urban. Rather, I'm just suggesting that it kind of fits in this same kind of like pattern of extensive low density settlement that I think does a couple of things. One, it allows people to stay close enough that they can cooperate effectively, but far enough apart that it alleviates a lot of that scalar stress or that irritation coefficient that I talked about as being like a major component of villages made of nucleated kind of aggregated sites. And I also think that I'm waiting to get some seasonality data, and I'll talk about that in a second to kind of like wrap up. But I think that at Letchworth, we're looking at a different kind of like periodicity or seasonality of ritual than is kind of like traditionally held for the Southeast, which is usually based on like green corn ceremony and agriculture. These people are not agriculturalists. So the kind of like the timing of gathering at Letchworth from around Lake Miccosukee was probably much different than what we would guess based on like ethnographically noted kind of like seasonal patterns of ceremony from ethnographic accounts. So in terms of next steps, I did just get word like a couple of weeks ago that I have been recommended for funding from the National Science Foundation to continue my research. So a couple of the next things that I want to do are to excavate some of the anomalies in the plaza to basically look at the timing of ceremonial activities in the plaza and how they relate to what we know from my excavations in the habitation areas, like our activities in the plaza happening at the same time as people are living at the site, and kind of like what phase. I also plan to analyze macro and microbotanical evidence to get an idea of like seasonality and subsistence. So what plant resources that they're using, what seasons did they grow, and when were they exploited. I also plan to do a neutron activation analysis study of ceramics from dated context throughout the site. So I can help, that'll help me to reconstruct kind of mobility and exchange patterns. I'm going to be working with Dr. Neil Wallace from the University of Florida on that. So here's acknowledgements, list of volunteers and everybody who helped me, and all of their various logos. So thank you very much to PAST and for everybody who helped me out with this field work. I really appreciate it. Also, if you are interested in reading more about this research, I did, as was mentioned in the introduction, I did just get some of this stuff published in American Antiquity. It's actually open access. So I'm going to post the link into the chat in case anybody would like to download the article. You can for free. It's not locked behind a paywall. Scientists and stuff, archaeologists are always talking about how we do a crap job of disseminating our research to the public and stuff. And it's kind of interesting then that the press that publishes this charges $3,000 or something like that to make an article open access. But luckily, a lot of large public universities like University of Michigan actually pay the fee for researchers at at those institutions. So thank you to the University of Michigan for paying my open access fee so I can give you all the article for free.
Great.
So that's that, and I can take any questions now.
So,
Okay, all right, questions?
What seasonality indicators do you currently have?
Did
So-
you hear the question? Okay.
Yeah, seasonality indicators that I currently have. So I've basically got nutshell, and I'm not a ethnobotanist, so I have some other charred botanicals, not that much, and I don't know what they are. So that's why I have to send them off for analysis. But faunal preservation at the site is really, really bad. I could probably fit the amount of bone that I found at the site through like 32 square meters of excavation. I could probably fit all of it in my 2 cupped hands. It's all of this very highly fragmented, charred bone. A lot of it looks like it's like turtle carapace or what is it, plaster on the underside. But other than that, like there's nothing that I could identify as like deer bone or anything like that. So almost no faunal record to go off of. So I'm going to be really heavily relying on the botanical stuff. And I think specifically the micro botanicals, because, you know, macro botanicals are present, but not in super huge quantities. Like I'm not getting like, you know, tons and tons of nutshell. I'm not getting like a lot of like an abundance of burnt seeds. Even from the hearth, like when I did flotation on sediments from the hearth, it basically everything just went up as a plume of ash. And then when things ran out through the flotation, I got a handful of like little flecks, but almost all of it just went poof. So that's kind of unfortunate, but you know, that's what the preservation environment is out there.
Lou?
Yeah, I've noticed there's no Mississippian element mentioned in this. It all appears to be woodland, highly related to, say, Kolomoki. When do you think this place was abandoned? And do you have any idea about what the events were that would cause the abandonment of major woodland, wheat Nile, or whatever, centers like this?
Okay, so you wanted to sorry, that last part I couldn't hear all of it. So you want to know kind of when it was abandoned and
When
why?
and why?
Okay, so there is evidence of Mississippian and even kind of like late prehistoric stuff out there. Like in my excavations, I did find Mississippian pottery, but in very small quantities, and they were usually like basically isolated finds. So it does seem like people in the Mississippian and kind of like, so like Fort Walton and then like Leon Jefferson period were like coming back. And, I don't think that's, like weird or anything like that. But in terms of when the major site, basically when people stopped coming there and like building mounds and gathering there on any regular basis, I would probably say it's like, like 80, 850 or 900. Just based on like when I stopped seeing radiocarbon dates from features, and when kind of like there's previous researchers that looked at collections from earlier landowners identified a lot of like Wakulla check stamped, which would be like late Weeden Island. So that would be going from like 8800 on to like early Fort Walton. I didn't find any, so I don't know where that stuff was coming from. But from the major habitation areas south of the mound, I think it's probably petering out around 8,800 or 900. And the big question, I guess, is like, or the big reason why I think is because almost all ceremonial centers in the region are depopulated at kind of like the same time. So like, you have evidence of like these late structures at Kolomoki. You have evidence of late structures at like Aspalaga, so like the Sycamore site that Milanich excavated. But those seem to be kind of like late occupations after the mound centers had been basically abandoned, where people just came back and it's like single households living there. So I think what happens is that a lot of these households basically disperse across the landscape and stop aggregating at these large centers. I can't say exactly why. Maybe like political disagreements became too much, or a lot of people think that like the advent of like maize agriculture in the region, and also the adoption of the bow and arrow meant that people just started fighting a lot more and wanting to get away from each other so they could grow corn. That's also, probably part of it. So I think it's a complex issue. So I can't give you an exact reason why, but I can tell you more or less when.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
How do you know how often this building would have been used, or how many people would use it?
So how long the building would have been used in what?
Large amount.
The structure,
Yeah, like how often?
how often would they have used it?
Frequently.
So with that structure, the fact that it's lightly built and it does maybe look like it has some evidence of maintenance, I think that it maybe would have been used for like a season or two tops. I can't say for sure, again, because the radiocarbon dates cluster so well together that it's like it doesn't look like that it doesn't look like there is one occupation and that people leave for a little while and then come back. It looks like two occupations that occur in rapid succession. So my thinking is either they stayed for a long enough time that they had to like rebuild the structure in place and reset the hearth, or that they were there for like a season, maybe a couple months, left and came back, and there was enough left of the structure that they rebuilt it in place like a year later or something like that. Again, I can't be absolutely sure.
You're talking about the structure that you excavated, not the large mound.
Oh, the mound. I don't know what seasons they would have used it. I think we have an idea of when they would have started building it. So they probably started building it in like the 3rd century AD. There is a radiocarbon date that was obtained by an archaeologist working for the state like a decade ago, from basically the ground floor right beneath the mound. So that basically indicates pretty well at least when they would have started building the mound. So yeah, like probably like AD 300. And then the mound seems to have been constructed in 3 separate phases in 3 separate tiers, but there's not been enough like charcoal or stuff like that obtained from those different layers of the mound to be able to tell kind of like the timing of when those layers would have been built. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yes, Craig.
I have a question.
Yeah.
We have an online question. One moment. Go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Martin. Very, very impressive work here.
Thank you.
Would you mind taking a moment, letting me know what criteria did you use in going from domestic to ceremonial?
Yeah. Okay. So I actually got this question, which I think is a very good one, when the review process for this article, which is like I looked at a lot of these sites when I was comparing the Letchworth structure to like Block Stearns and Kolomoki, and I basically looked for structures at sites that the excavators either interpreted as being domestic structures themselves, or where there was evidence of structures in an area that seemed to be associated with domestic occupation. So like Block Stearns, there are a ton of these like pit features, and a lot of them are filled with like ceremonial debris interspersed among these structures, but a lot of them are also filled with like habitation debris. And so basically I contrasted structures that, seem to be from kind of like midden or habitation contexts from those like there is, I think it's the Mound B structure at like McKeithen, which is, it's on top of a mound. It's way bigger. It's like 2 or 3 times the size of most of the other structures here. I think that one is it's very easy to say that is probably a ceremonial structure because it's so much bigger and it's on the top of a mound. So the context is totally different. But for these domestic structures, I was looking for stuff that's like in a midden or otherwise within a habitation area, and that the excavators interpreted as being habitation structures, so houses. Does that answer your question?
Oh, okay. And we had another question here at the Martin House, Craig.
My question is, do you have any insight into the anomalous size of this structure for this cultural period? It's completely different and much larger than any other early woodland site. Even if you look at Colemoke Mounds D and E, they're much smaller, maybe 20 feet maximum. Whereas this structure is enormous for this time period.
Yeah, so I would say that that Letchworth is huge, and it's anomalously huge, but it's it also has a partner in Colemoke, because Colemoke's platform mound is bigger and taller. But I think there is a kind of a there are there are a lot of these ceremonial centers that crop up, but there's only like one or two in this area of the Gulf Coast where they're building mounds that big. Like McKeithen's mounds, nowhere near that. Crystal River has I think the big mound there tops out at 30 feet. It's maybe half, it's a little over half the height of the one at Letchworth, and barely that of the one at Colemoke. So I think that Letchworth is obviously a very important site regionally. And I'm really looking forward to the results from the NAA study, because I think that that's going to help us kind of identify just how important Letchworth might have been in terms of potentially seeing connections between Letchworth and other sites in the region. Yeah, I think that Letchworth is extremely impressive, but I think that it's unfortunately it's not the biggest mound at the biggest site. Colemoke's got me beat. But it's got Letchworth beat.
The big mound at Colemoke is much later time period.
Well, so there's been some recent dating of that, and it's actually not. It dates to the seventh or 8th century or something, like 7th century AD. So it's basically the mound. There was, what was it? One of the early excavators. It was Palmer or something like that in the 1880s or 1890s. He excavated something that was held in a museum. I think it's from that excavation that. So my advisor at USF, Tom Placan, dated for a kind of a study that we did, and that was from the big mound, from one of the kind of later capping layers, and it ended up being at the same time as the rest of the village, which seems to date to the woodland period. So I think all of Colemoke is woodland, just like Letchworth.
Okay, I actually have a question. You compared the structure there to one at Blockstern.
Mm-hmm.
How are you determining that that the one at Letchworth is had the overarching dome shape to it versus the eave shape? Is it based on the diameter of the poles that were used? Are you basing that on ethnographic information or?
Yeah, so it's based on the diameter of the poles. There's actually this really cool, it was like a master's thesis that this guy at University of Alabama did, where he basically constructed a Mississippian wall trench house and burned it down, and then did the archaeology of the house that he built and burned down. And basically what he found is that a lot of those Mississippian structures with prefabricated wall trench, these wall trench structures were probably bent pole structures where they're bending stuff over and tying it together because of the diameter of the post holes. And he basically identified kind of a threshold where it's if you're looking at a post hole that's below 10 centimeters, really more around 7 or 8 centimeters, then it can actually be effectively bent and tied together. Any larger than that, and they're just too hard to bend, and you just can't do it. So that's what I'm basing it on, is actually from experimental archaeology, from some guy who had a very cool master's thesis.
Great. All right. Does anybody else have any questions? Craig has another question, another comment.
Yeah.
The large mound, why are the stewards of that site allowing all of those trees to continue to grow on that mound? It's continuing to cause destruction to features, any remains. or any artifacts there.
Why are they continuing to allow trees to grow there?
Yeah.
Yes, on the map.
Yeah, so I've actually talked to the park rangers out there, and they are actively, I think slowly but actively, denuding the mound of trees. But they want to do it in kind of this staged process because removing all the trees all at once could allow kind of like erosion to take place that they're worried about. So they're trying to cut down the trees and stage that with allowing more kind of like ground cover to grow up, basically to stabilize because it's a sand mound. Like if there aren't roots holding it together, it'll just run away like crazy. So yeah, I think they are cutting down trees, but they're doing it in kind of like this very slow managed process. So I don't know how much progress they've made over the pandemic or what, but that was a process that they had started at least in like late 2019 when I started working out there.
So it's on their radar for sure.
It's on their radar for sure. And a lot of the smaller burial mounds, they have removed all the trees from already. And so they have like interpretive mowing to basically kind of like allow you to, when you visit the site, you can see the mounds, because otherwise they would be overgrown and you wouldn't be able to.
I can speak to that a little bit. I worked with the Florida Park Service for 30 years, and I was in management of over natural resources. And we had a long statutorily established relationship with DHR, and we were always worried about these things. And we always would ask DHR, and DHR would never tell us, yes, you should take the trees off. And I'm not sure why that was, other than they were ambivalent about it. We had one experience when we tried, I think it was on our own, maybe we consulted with DHR at the time too. We tried to take the trees off the Lake Jackson Mound in Sierra Club, went ballistic. So, we love Sierra Club and all, but it's just controversial. It's not a cut and dry answer, even when you're asking for advice from DHR. So.
Well, don't look at me. I'm just an archaeological collections manager.
I mean, I think one thing that the park managers expressed to me, and I don't know if this holds for other parks, but is like, at some of these state parks, they're focused on protection of kind of natural and cultural resources. But for a park like Letchworth, the main focus is on the cultural resources. And I think that it might be depending on the park, how willing they are to kind of like, cut down trees and modify the natural landscape in order to protect the cultural resources. So I don't know, but that seems like there probably is a kind of like nuanced approach to it.
It wouldn't be left up to the park manager. That would be a decision.
How does the national park do?
Parks, superintendents are little kingdoms, and the superintendents can decide how to do management pretty much as they please. So, for example, at Fort Frederica, when a local group thought that the site would be better if it had trees on it, the superintendent had no problem in having them go out and plant trees on the British town, even though they were told that doing so would eventually lead to destruction of the archaeological resources and the basis for which the park was created. So it's up to management to decide whether they want to support their local benefactors who like trees versus the archaeologists who think trees are a bad idea.
Yes.
Well, it brings an interesting question. During the time of construction and use of these mounds, I wonder if there's any indication in the excavation of what the ground cover was. If it was in fact just a sand mound, how the heck did they keep it from washing away?
Beats me, man. I have no idea.
Weren't there at Letchworth, weren't there like different layers of clay?
I think that there is some clay in the construction episodes, but it doesn't cover, it's not like whole capping layers from what I remember of the coring that's been done there. Mm-hmm. So, but that's the thing is there hasn't really been any kind of like extensive excavation of the mounds. There's been some coring to look for construction stages and maybe a couple of units placed into like the foot of it. to try and look for the interface between like the natural ground surface and when they started building stuff on top. But I don't think anybody's really tried to look for evidence of ground cover. And even after like 1,500 years, I would imagine that a lot of that original surface of the mound is probably eroded anyway.
I wonder if they did some burning that would keep the vegetation, the large vegetation under control and would encourage the understory vegetation, the grasses. Probably did, because they probably did a lot of burning at that time.
We have another question in the back.
Well, it's a comment. I can tell you, I actually grew up literally right next to the Crystal River Mounds. Like me and my brother used to go play on them when we were a kid. You walk down to the end of my street, go through this little trail, we're right next to it. Those things were just massive oyster shells. Just hundreds of thousands of oyster shells. Wow.
Yeah.
Is this the same civilization as what's going on here? Because
so, I mean, like, in the same sense that like, it's in the same sense that like, Athens and Sparta are different city states. So they're different political entities within kind of like Greek civilization. That would be kind of like the same deal that's going on here, that these are probably different sites. And the people that live there probably thought of themselves as being different from one another, but they were probably connected by kind of like, common beliefs, at least what we know archaeologically, like common projectile point and ceramic types, things like that. So that's probably the best analogy I can think of.
Yes, another question.
Has there been much work done specifically around Lake Miccosukee to identify any villages or areas that populations that would have gone to this mound, as a, seasonal, center that really would have been the focus? Because I think having the mound there is certainly a safe place and being away from, all the general day-to-day type stuff. But being around Miccosukee would certainly be, a good place to be for food sources and such.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be like having the grocery store like right in your backyard. But yeah. So there have been a couple surveys out there. So Lewis Tesser's 1980, like the Leon County like bicentennial survey hit, I think, like a big portion of like the western bank of Lake Miccosukee, the Leon County part. And there have been some other surveys in various other parts. So there are quite a few sites that are documented dating to the woodland period around Lake Miccosukee. A lot of them are actually Weeden Island. So they date to a little bit later than the house that I excavated, which is an interesting thing that I'm gonna, more work is required. More research is always required. But there are quite a few sites around there. I don't know if anybody has in the time since tried to do like a full like site inventory of Lake Miccosukee and its immediate surroundings. But that's actually something that I'm kind of interested in doing after my dissertation, because I'm really interested in learning more about the larger settlement system. So maybe as like a follow-up project once my dissertation is over, I would like to.
You had mentioned dating pottery with meal walls, and so I was just thinking that for a comparative, a larger comparative sample as to same thing and such, and where things were coming from, how much was done locally, how much was traded and that such.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely correct. And I think one of the important things about doing something like that with outlying sites as well is that you'd be able to get an idea of if there is a difference in terms of the kind of connections that people have from Letchworth itself and with the smaller habitation sites elsewhere along the lake. So basically, like, how much different is the ceremonial center from the just normal habitation sites? So yeah, that's spot on. Something that I'm very interested in pursuing in the future. So, I just gotta
Let's get him, get through his dissertation first. Let's get that dissertation done first. Yes, Lonnie.
I'm wondering, of course, the village was out there in the 1820s, the Mississippi village that was raided by Andrew Jackson. Those guys must have gone over there and snooped around on those mounds. Was there any like Chattahoochee brush in the assemblage?
Chattahoochee brushed from where?
In the assemblage that were from Letchworth. Was there any Chattahoochee brush in the assemblage?
None that I saw. I don't know about all of the other collections. I would imagine like maybe because like I think the historic seminal town of Miccosukee is supposed to be like on the west bank of Lake Miccosukee or pretty darn close. And so that's like a major Seminole settlement. So I wouldn't be surprised if to find stuff like to find Chattahoochee brushed in the area, because I think that's like Seminole pottery, if I'm not mistaken. Or it's like very late. Yeah. So yeah, I didn't find any, but I would not be surprised at all if it's around.
Any other questions? Anybody online have any questions? No? Well, Marty, as usual, it was a wonderful presentation, gave us a lot to think about, and just very impressive, all the work that you've done so far, and see just a wealth of information just from this project, and I know that we'll see a lot more from you in the future. Look forward to that. Are you going to be presenting at the FAS meetings on Letchworth?
Yeah. Great. So if anybody's going to be in Miami, I'll be talking about kind of the same stuff. I'm probably going to alter things a little bit because this one went, I think I only get 20 minutes and this was much longer.
You have to trim it back a little bit.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to those who joined us online, and thank you to everybody here. And I think Tom, my sound man, Tom is still here. Got to give a shout out to Tom McCluskey. He's just amazing. Always willing to help us with the sound, and we're still trying to figure out this new system, but thank you so much, Tom. You're awesome. All right, well, I'm going to stop recording now and keep my glasses on.